Even if the defense successfully casts doubt on some of the earlier physical abuse charges, the conduct alleged in the later period still carries enormous legal consequences. Let us go through the full indictment carefully, because understanding each charge matters. The first 6 counts in the original complaint addressed the alleged sexual abuse itself, the physical incidents that the victim described to investigators. These carry serious penalties on their own. Then the grand jury returned 6 additional counts. Count 8 is pattern of official misconduct, a second-degree felony. This charge is specifically tied to Fistler's role as a public school teacher. It alleges that she committed 2 or more acts in connection with her official position that constituted an unauthorized exercise of her authority as a teacher. This charge matters because it explicitly links the alleged criminal conduct to the professional power she held over the victim. It is not just that an adult did something wrong. It is that a person in a position of institutional authority used that position in a way the law prohibits. Teachers have a duty of care to their students. The law treats violations of that duty differently from conduct between strangers. Count 9 is manufacturing child sexual abuse material, and it is a first-degree felony, the most serious classification of charge. Prosecutors allege that between May 2023 and April 2025, Fistler knowingly caused or permitted the victim to engage in prohibited sexual acts that were or may have been photographed or filmed. During this entire window, the victim was a minor, 15, 16, and eventually 17 years old. This charge transforms what might otherwise be viewed primarily as a case about historical abuse into something with recent documented digital evidence of ongoing criminal conduct involving a minor. The manufacturing charge carries the most severe potential penalties of anything in this indictment. Count 10 is possession of child sexual abuse material, a third-degree felony. This alleges that Fistler knowingly possessed fewer than 1,000 items depicting the sexual exploitation or abuse of a child. Count 11 is distribution of obscenity to a minor, also a third-degree felony, covering a specific window from August 2021 to August 2022, during which Fistler allegedly distributed obscene material to someone under 18. Count 12 is endangering the welfare of a child, a second-degree felony, which alleges that Fistler, having a legal duty of care for the victim in her role as his teacher, engaged in sexual conduct that would impair or corrupt the morals of a child. 12 counts total, ranging from third-degree to first-degree felonies. If convicted on the most serious charges, the potential consequences are severe and long-lasting. This is not a situation where a good outcome for the defense means walking away clean. Even a partial conviction on the more serious counts would have an enormous impact on the rest of Fistler's life. There is one more element to address that the prosecution raised at the detention hearing, and which the defense has pushed back on firmly. Prosecutors suggested that the investigation is ongoing, and that at least one other family has reported inappropriate communications from Fistler to another student. Cyperone said publicly that he has seen absolutely no evidence to support that claim, and that he is optimistic it will not materialize into additional charges. He may be right. Sometimes these things come up in hearings and do not develop further. Sometimes they do. That is something to watch as the case moves forward. What happens next follows a fairly predictable procedural path. Even if the outcome at the end of that path is anything but predictable, the arraignment on the new indictment will be scheduled within the coming weeks. Cyperone had not received notice of a specific date yet at the time of his public comments. At the arraignment, Fistler will enter a formal plea to the charges in the indictment. Following that, the discovery process will unfold. Cyperone will receive the full body of evidence, all 7,500 pages of texts, all photographs, all forensic analysis results, all police reports and witness statements. His team will go through every piece of it. The defense may file motions to suppress certain evidence or to exclude particular materials from trial. The prosecution will respond. A judge will rule. This process takes time, months, potentially more than a year, before this case reaches a jury. Throughout all of that, Ashley Fistler will remain in custody unless something changes. She will sit in a jail cell while her attorney works. She will be separated from her husband, from her home, from whatever remained of her former life. She has not been convicted of anything. She is legally presumed innocent. Those are facts. They exist alongside the other facts. The arrest, the detention ruling, the 12-count indictment, the 7,500 pages, the photographs, and the words a young man wrote to her about the things she allegedly broke inside of him. There are cases that make you stop and think about how much can go wrong behind closed doors, inside the very institutions we trust most with our children. This is one of those cases. A middle school teacher, a former student, 7,500 pages of text messages, nude photographs, and now 12 criminal charges, including manufacturing child sexual abuse material. This is the story of Ashley Fistler, and we are going to walk through every single detail from the very beginning, because this case deserves that level of attention and care. It starts quietly, the way these cases often do. In January of 2026, a now adult male came forward to law enforcement. He was no longer a child. He had been carrying something for years, and at some point he made the decision that he was done carrying it alone. He contacted investigators and told them that his former middle school teacher, Ashley Fistler, had sexually abused him multiple times when he was a student. Not once. Not twice. Multiple times, across an extended period of time that prosecutors would later describe as spanning 6 full years. He said incidents happened in her car. He said incidents happened inside her classroom, the same classroom where, back in 2018, her husband had gotten down on one knee and proposed marriage to her. That detail lands differently when you sit with it for a moment. A place associated with one of the most romantic moments of her personal life is now at the center of a criminal case involving the sexual abuse of a child. When investigators received this report, they did not treat it lightly. The Gloucester County Prosecutor's Office brought in their high-tech crimes unit and launched a forensic analysis of the victim's digital devices. They pulled his phone, and what they found on that phone changed the entire trajectory of this case. There were years of text messages between the victim and Ashley Fistler, a long documented digital record of their communications, and alongside those messages were nude photographs of Fistler that she had allegedly sent to the victim herself. This was not a case that rested solely on one person's word against another. There was a digital paper trail preserved on a phone waiting to be found. Ashley Fistler was arrested in March of 2026. She has been in jail ever since. She did not post bail. She did not go home to her family. She went directly into custody, and that is where she has remained. Her husband has not filed for divorce. They are still legally married, and by all public accounts, he has continued to stand by her. But everything else about her life, her freedom, her routine, her career, her position in the community, all of it collapsed the moment those handcuffs went on. In April of 2026, the case went to a detention hearing. This is a proceeding where the court determines whether the accused will be released on bail while the case moves forward, or whether they will remain in custody. These hearings can be brief and uneventful. This one was not. What the prosecution laid out in that courtroom was extraordinary, and it is worth going through in real detail because it gives you the clearest picture of what the state says happened here and how much evidence they believe they have. The prosecutor told the judge that there were 7,500 pages of text messages between Ashley Fistler and the victim. That number is almost hard to process. 7,500 pages. To put that in perspective, the average novel is somewhere between 250 and 400 pages. These text messages alone represent the equivalent of somewhere between 15 and 30 full-length books of content. This was not a casual exchange. This was a sustained, long-running, deeply involved communication between a teacher and a student, and then a former student, that went on for years. The prosecution told the judge that these messages, in their view, showed a clear pattern of grooming, manipulation, and abuse that began when the victim was just 12 years old. 12. That is the age at which all of this allegedly started. And prosecutors said it did not stop when the physical contact stopped. The communication continued. The nature of that communication, according to what was presented in court, remained sexual and inappropriate long after Fistler had left the school entirely. Prosecutors described specific exchanges from the text record. In August of 2023, they said Fistler was messaging the victim reminiscing about times when he had been her student in middle school, specifically describing a time when he came to her classroom during her prep period and they were physically intimate. That is not a teacher and former student catching up. That is an adult woman reliving and referencing alleged criminal conduct as though it were a fond memory. In December of 2023, the victim opened up to Fistler about struggling in school. A normal adult in this person's life would have offered support, guidance, or encouragement. According to prosecutors, Fistler's response was enthusiastic in a way that had nothing to do with his academic well-being. That same month, prosecutors said she offered something deeply inappropriate that they described in court. A few months after that, in February of 2024, she allegedly offered to purchase a sex toy for the victim. These are the kinds of details that are difficult to sit with. But they matter because they speak directly to the prosecution's argument that this was not an isolated lapse in judgment. This was ongoing. This was deliberate. This was a pattern that stretched across years and continued even as the victim was trying to move forward with his life. And then there are the victim's own words, read aloud in court by the prosecutor. He had written to Fistler, at some point in their exchanges, that he had to try very hard to rebuild the things that she broke inside of him. He said she destroyed things inside of him. He said she stripped him of his innocence. These are not the words of someone who experienced something minor or ambiguous. These are the words of someone who is naming, clearly and directly, the damage that was done to them. And Fistler's alleged response to those words? She said she felt like she had forced him to grow up abnormally quickly. The prosecution pointed to that response as significant, as an acknowledgement in her own words that she understood the impact of what had happened between them. The judge, after hearing all of this, ruled that Ashley Fistler would not be released on bail. He found that she posed a danger to the community, That is the legal standard required to keep someone in custody prior to conviction, and the judge concluded that standard was met. Fistler's attorney, Rocco Ciparone, disagreed with that ruling and filed an appeal. But the appeal did not change the outcome. She stayed in jail. She's still there now. Rocco Ciparone is an experienced attorney, a former federal prosecutor who has been doing this work for nearly 4 decades. He has been open in some of his public comments about the case, and it is worth taking what he has said seriously because the defense perspective matters. In a criminal case, the prosecution is not the only voice in the room. The defense exists for a reason. Ciparone has made several important points. He has pointed out correctly that the grand jury indictment is not a verdict. A grand jury proceeding is entirely one-sided. The prosecutor walks in, presents evidence, and argues for charges. The defense attorney is not permitted in the room. Witnesses cannot be cross-examined. Evidence cannot be challenged. There is no judge presiding over the proceedings in the same way. And the burden of proof required to return an indictment is probable cause, which is a much, much lower bar than what will be required to convict at trial, where the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Ciparone is right that many people see a headline about an indictment and assume conviction is inevitable. That is not how the system works. He has also pointed out that at the time of the detention hearing in April, he had received the prosecution's materials barely a day in advance. That is a significant constraint. Attorneys need time to review evidence, understand it, and prepare responses. Going into a high-stakes hearing with less than a day's preparation is not a level playing field. He acknowledged in public comments that he had begun preparing a defense from the day he was hired, but that his strategy would necessarily evolve once he received full discovery, which, as of the interview, he still had not received. He acknowledged something else that stood out. He said, on the record, that some of the text messages that have been referenced publicly are not good for the defense. He did not say they were all innocent. He said he needed the full context before drawing conclusions, and he was not willing to share his defense theory publicly at this stage. That is a strategically sound position. Defense attorneys do not announce their plans in advance, especially in cases where the evidence landscape is still coming into focus. There are legal commentators who have observed that the defense in a case like this often gravitates toward a specific argument, that the text messages, however inappropriate and disturbing, do not prove that physical sexual conduct actually occurred. That the digital communication, while potentially criminal on its own, is a different category from the physical abuse alleged in the original complaint. This line of argument would push the jury to ask whether the victim's account of physical incidents can be proven beyond the texts alone. Without corroborating physical evidence of the earlier incidents, the prosecution's case on those specific counts would rest heavily on the victim's credibility as a witness and on whatever the texts can be argued to imply. But here is where that potential defense runs into serious difficulty. First, the victim gave a detailed statement to police. Second, the prosecution appears to have photographic evidence, nude photographs allegedly sent by Fistler herself. Third, count 9 of the new indictment, manufacturing child sexual abuse material, covers a period from May 2023 to April 2025, during which the victim was between 15 and 17 years old. That is a period after the alleged physical abuse ended, and it still generates serious criminal liability on its own. The prosecution's theory does not require a jury to convict on all 12 counts simultaneously. Even if the defense successfully casts doubt on some of the earlier physical abuse charges, the conduct alleged in the later period still carries enormous legal consequences. Let us go through the full indictment carefully, because understanding each charge matters. The first 6 counts in the original complaint addressed the alleged sexual abuse itself, the physical incidents that the victim described to investigators. These carry serious penalties on their own. Then the grand jury returned 6 additional counts. Count 8 is pattern of official misconduct, a second-degree felony. This charge is specifically tied to Fistler's role as a public school teacher. It alleges that she committed 2 or more acts in connection with her official position that constituted an unauthorized exercise of her authority as a teacher. This charge matters because it explicitly links the alleged criminal conduct to the professional power she held over the victim. It is not just that an adult did something wrong. It is that a person in a position of institutional authority used that position in a way the law prohibits. Teachers have a duty of care to their students. The law treats violations of that duty differently from conduct between strangers. Count 9 is manufacturing child sexual abuse material, and it is a first-degree felony, the most serious classification of charge. Prosecutors allege that between May 2023 and April 2025, Fistler knowingly caused or permitted the victim to engage in prohibited sexual acts that were or may have been photographed or filmed. During this entire window, the victim was a minor, 15, 16, and eventually 17 years old. This charge transforms what might otherwise be viewed primarily as a case about historical abuse into something with recent documented digital evidence of ongoing criminal conduct involving a minor. The manufacturing charge carries the most severe potential penalties of anything in this indictment. Count 10 is possession of child sexual abuse material, a third-degree felony. This alleges that Fistler knowingly possessed fewer than 1,000 items depicting the sexual exploitation or abuse of a child. Count 11 is distribution of obscenity to a minor, also a third-degree felony, covering a specific window from August 2021 to August 2022, during which Fistler allegedly distributed obscene material to someone under 18. Count 12 is endangering the welfare of a child, a second-degree felony, which alleges that Fistler, having a legal duty of care for the victim in her role as his teacher, engaged in sexual conduct that would impair or corrupt the morals of a child. 12 counts total, ranging from third-degree to first-degree felonies. If convicted on the most serious charges, the potential consequences are severe and long-lasting. This is not a situation where a good outcome for the defense means walking away clean. Even a partial conviction on the more serious counts would have an enormous impact on the rest of Fistler's life. There is one more element to address that the prosecution raised at the detention hearing, and which the defense has pushed back on firmly. Prosecutors suggested that the investigation is ongoing, and that at least one other family has reported inappropriate communications from Fistler to another student. Cyperone said publicly that he has seen absolutely no evidence to support that claim, and that he is optimistic it will not materialize into additional charges. He may be right. Sometimes these things come up in hearings and do not develop further. Sometimes they do. That is something to watch as the case moves forward. What happens next follows a fairly predictable procedural path. Even if the outcome at the end of that path is anything but predictable, the arraignment on the new indictment will be scheduled within the coming weeks. Cyperone had not received notice of a specific date yet at the time of his public comments. At the arraignment, Fistler will enter a formal plea to the charges in the indictment. Following that, the discovery process will unfold. Cyperone will receive the full body of evidence, all 7,500 pages of texts, all photographs, all forensic analysis results, all police reports and witness statements. His team will go through every piece of it. The defense may file motions to suppress certain evidence or to exclude particular materials from trial. The prosecution will respond. A judge will rule. This process takes time, months, potentially more than a year, before this case reaches a jury. Throughout all of that, Ashley Fistler will remain in custody unless something changes. She will sit in a jail cell while her attorney works. She will be separated from her husband, from her home, from whatever remained of her former life. She has not been convicted of anything. She is legally presumed innocent. Those are facts. They exist alongside the other facts. The arrest, the detention ruling, the 12-count indictment, the 7,500 pages, the photographs, and the words a young man wrote to her about the things she allegedly broke inside of him. This case has a long road ahead of it, but the foundation it is built on, the digital evidence, the victim's statement, the scope and timeline of the alleged conduct, makes it one that legal observers are watching closely. The prosecution appears to believe it has a strong case. The defense believes it has room to fight. A jury will ultimately decide who is right, and when that day comes, we will be here covering it. For now, what we know is this. A young man came forward in January of 2026 and said something happened to him that no child should ever have to experience. Investigators took him seriously. They found evidence. An arrest was made. Charges were filed. More charges followed. And the process that is supposed to sort truth from allegation is now underway. And whatever the outcome, the fact that someone finally spoke up, after years of carrying this, is the moment this entire case turned on. That matters. That will always matter. We will keep following this case and bring you updates as they come. If you found this breakdown thorough and useful, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. See you in the next one. Let us take a step back and think about the broader picture of what a case like this reveals, not just about Ashley Fistler and not just about this one victim, but about patterns that exist in educational environments and why cases like this one are both more common than people expect and harder to prosecute than people assume. Understanding the context does not excuse anything. It explains how these situations develop and persist, sometimes for years, without anyone outside the relationship knowing what is happening. Grooming is a word that gets used frequently in cases involving the sexual abuse of minors by adults in positions of authority, and it is worth explaining what it actually means because the word sometimes gets lost in the noise of a criminal case. Grooming is not a single act. It is a process. It is a slow, deliberate building of trust and emotional dependency that happens over time, often so gradually that the person being groomed does not immediately recognize what is happening. It involves an adult identifying a vulnerable young person, establishing a connection with them, making them feel special and seen in ways that feel genuinely meaningful to the child, and then gradually pushing boundaries in ways that normalize what would otherwise be clearly inappropriate behavior. By the time any kind of physical contact occurs, the child has often been conditioned to view the relationship as normal or even desirable. which is precisely what makes these situations so psychologically damaging in the long term. In the context of a school, a teacher is already in a position of extraordinary power and trust. Students are expected to listen to their teachers, to please them, to earn their approval. Grades, recommendations, classroom treatment, all of it flows from the teacher. And when a student believes their teacher genuinely cares for them on a deeper level, the attachment that forms can feel overwhelming. And when an adult in that position begins to use that attachment in harmful ways, the student may not have the emotional or cognitive tools to name what is happening, let alone resist it or report it. This is not a failure of the child. It is the intended consequence of what the abuser has been building. In this case, prosecutors described a pattern that allegedly began when the victim was 12 years old and continued across 6 years. That covers the entirety of what most people would recognize as formative adolescence, the years during which identity is shaped, relationships are understood, and emotional foundations are built. To have that entire period allegedly shadowed and damaged by this kind of relationship is something that does not heal quickly or cleanly. The victim's own words in those text messages about rebuilding what was broken, about having innocence stripped away, reflect exactly the kind of lasting harm that psychologists who study childhood sexual abuse consistently describe. These are not just phrases, they are a real person describing their actual internal experience, which brings us to the question of why it took so long for this to come to light publicly. The victim came forward in January of 2026. The alleged abuse began around 2014 or 2015, if we work backward from the prosecution's timeline. That is a gap of more than a decade between when the conduct allegedly started and when a formal report was made. This is not unusual. Studies on childhood sexual abuse consistently show that the majority of survivors do not report what happened to them for years, if ever. There are many reasons for this, including fear of not being believed, shame that belongs to the abuser but is often carried by the survivor, concern about the consequences of coming forward, and in cases like this one, an ongoing emotional connection to the abuser that complicates the survivor's ability to clearly name what was done to them. The text messages that prosecutors have described actually illuminate this dynamic in a painful way. The victim and Fistler were apparently still in contact years after the alleged physical conduct ended. The victim was still communicating with her, still sharing personal struggles, still in some kind of relationship with the person who allegedly caused so much harm. This is not evidence that the abuse did not happen. It is actually consistent with what experts describe as the aftermath of grooming. The emotional dependency that was built does not simply dissolve when the conduct ends. The relationship, in a distorted form, can continue long after the harm itself. It was only when the victim reached a point where he was able to name what had happened, where he could write to Fistler that she had destroyed things inside of him, that he had worked hard to rebuild himself, that the path toward coming forward became possible. And then he did come forward. In January of 2026, he walked into a situation where he would have to tell strangers the most vulnerable and painful parts of his life, knowing that it would lead to an investigation, an arrest, a public case, media coverage, and a long trial. That decision required something that should not be underestimated. Now consider what the prosecution faces at trial. The foundation of their case on the earlier physical abuse charges is the victim's testimony. He will have to take the stand. He will have to describe in specific detail what he says happened to him, and then the defense will cross-examine him. That is how the adversarial system works. Defense attorneys are ethically obligated to challenge the prosecution's evidence and witnesses vigorously, and that means the victim will face hard questions about his memory, about the timeline, about the nature of the relationship, and about why he continued to communicate with Fistler for years after the alleged abuse ended. None of that will be easy. Some of it may be genuinely painful to sit through as a viewer or observer, but it is part of the process that exists to ensure the truth comes out, not just one side of it. The prosecution has something that makes the victim's testimony significantly more powerful than it would be in a case without digital evidence. They have the texts, they have photographs, they have a forensic record of communications that spans years. The defense cannot simply argue that this never happened and point to a lack of physical evidence, because the digital evidence creates a documented context that is very difficult to explain away. A defense attorney can argue that texts are being taken out of context. But 7,500 pages of messages is an enormous body of material, and juries are often quite capable of reading through extended communications and forming their own conclusions about what those communications reveal about the nature of a relationship. The photographs that were allegedly found on the victim's phone during the forensic analysis are also significant. Nude photographs allegedly sent by Fistler to the victim, if authenticated and admitted into evidence, go well beyond what any innocent explanation can cover. A teacher does not send photographs of that nature to a student or a former student under any professional or innocent interpretation. The existence of those photographs and the specific circumstances under which they were discovered is a piece of evidence that the defense will need to confront directly rather than sidestep. And then there is count 9, the manufacturing of child sexual abuse material charge, which covers the period from May 2023 to April 2025. This is not ancient history that allegedly happened years before anyone thought to investigate. This is relatively recent conduct. The victim was a minor throughout this entire period, ranging from 15 to 17 years old. If the prosecution can prove that Fistler knowingly caused or permitted the victim to engage in sexual conduct that was photographed or filmed during this window, that charge alone, as a first-degree felony, carries consequences that would reshape the rest of her life regardless of what happens with any of the other 11 counts in the indictment. What the defense will argue in response to all of this remains to be seen in full. Ciparone has been careful not to commit to a specific theory publicly, which is exactly what an experienced attorney would do at this early stage of proceedings. But the general shape of a possible defense is not impossible to imagine. They will likely challenge the voluntariness and context of certain communications. They may argue that the physical conduct described by the victim did not occur, or did not occur in the way he describes it, and that the texts, while potentially inappropriate and even illegal on their own grounds, do not prove the physical allegations. On count 9, they will almost certainly challenge the specific evidence that the prosecution intends to use to prove that prohibited sexual acts were photographed or filmed, and that Fistler knowingly caused or permitted this to happen. How a jury receives all of this depends on many things that cannot be predicted from the outside at this stage, including the specific jurors selected, the skill of the attorneys in presenting their respective cases, the judge's rulings on what evidence is admissible and what is not, and ultimately what the full body of evidence actually shows when it is laid out under the scrutiny of a real trial with both sides fully engaged. Courts exist precisely because these questions are genuinely difficult, and because the stakes for everyone involved are too high to leave to guesswork or public opinion. What we can say with confidence is that this case is going to continue to draw significant attention. The charges are serious and wide-ranging. The evidence base, as described publicly so far, is substantial in scope. The victim's willingness to come forward and see this process through what will likely be a long, emotionally taxing experience is something that took genuine courage. And whatever happens, when 12 jurors eventually return to a courtroom with a verdict, the underlying reality at the center of this case is that a person says he was harmed in a profound and lasting way by someone who held a position of trust and authority over him during some of the most formative years of his life. That is what this case is ultimately about. Not the procedural steps, not the legal maneuvering, not even the eventual verdict whenever that day arrives. It is about a child who allegedly had something taken from him that he spent years trying to rebuild, and who eventually decided that what happened to him deserved to be named, investigated, and answered for in a court of law. We will be here to follow every development as this case moves forward. When arraignment happens, we cover it. When the full discovery picture becomes clearer and the defense theory takes shape, we will analyze it. When trial begins, we will be watching. And we will always bring you the facts, the context, and the full picture, because that is the only way to do justice to cases that matter this much. If this breakdown was useful to you, hit subscribe so you do not miss a single update on this case or any of the other cases we cover with this level of depth. I will see you in the next one. There is one more thing worth saying before we close out this breakdown, and it has to do with how we talk about cases like this one in public. True crime content, at its worst, treats real tragedies as entertainment. It chases the most sensational details, strips away the humanity of the people involved, and moves on the moment a newer story comes along. That is not what this channel is about. Every person in this case is a real human being. The victim is a real person who made a courageous decision to come forward and is now living through one of the hardest experiences imaginable. Ashley Fistler is a real person who has not been convicted of anything, who has a family, and whose life has been completely upended by an arrest and a set of charges that the legal system has not yet fully adjudicated. Her attorney is doing his job. The investigators did their job. The prosecutors are doing theirs. And eventually, a jury will do its job. Our job is to pay attention carefully, report what is actually known versus what is alleged, and resist the pull toward easy conclusions. Cases that look overwhelming on paper sometimes fall apart at trial. Cases that seem straightforward sometimes reveal unexpected complexity. The system is designed to handle that uncertainty. A jury of 12 people, hearing everything from both sides under rules of evidence designed to ensure fairness, is supposed to produce a verdict that reflects the truth as best as it can be determined. We trust that process, even when it is slow, even when it is imperfect, even when the outcome is not what anyone expected. So we will keep watching. We will keep reporting. We will be here when this case reaches its conclusion, ready to cover it with the same depth and care we brought to this breakdown today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.